everybody. Happy Friday, and thank you for joining us on The Headline. I'm Brandon Waltens, Managing Editor of Texas Scorecard, and we're going to look at a couple of the big stories that happened here. I'm happy to be back here in the studio. We're going to take a look at some of the big stories that happened here during the week here in Texas. And if you're watching live right now, please feel free to drop some comments down there. Let us know where you're watching from. Let us know if you have any questions about anything that's been going on this week. But I want to get right to it. We've got joining me first today, Cary Cheshire, the president of Texans for Fiscal Responsibility, who has just put out their Fiscal Responsibility Index, which is essentially a grading tool for lawmakers, see how they voted specifically on fiscal issues in Austin. And I know you're getting a lot of feedback from that. Cary, thank you for joining. And first of all, what is the Fiscal Responsibility Index? Y'all been doing this for a long time.
Well, that's right, Brandon. Ever since 2007, we've been producing the Fiscal Responsibility Index, a kind of report card for citizens to view how their lawmaker voted on tax, budget, role of government, limited government votes in the Texas legislature. Lawmakers come in, they file thousands of bills, they take thousands of votes, and it's difficult for everyday Texans to sit there and keep track of what's going on in the legislature. We go through and distill those things down to things that taxpayers can understand. We let folks know ahead of time what's going to be on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. There's no pop quizzes. And then at the end of the session, we produce what we did earlier this week, where we give every lawmaker a grade, 0 to 100, and every taxpayer can go and view what their lawmaker's grade is and all of the votes that got them that grade.
Yes, so I'm looking here, and y'all use this session. It changes session to session, but this year you used 151 votes taken in the House, 79 votes taken in the Senate, and taking a look at what actually what those results looked like. In the House, you had the top scorer was actually a freshman.
Yeah, that's right. State Representative Bryan Slayton from out there in Royce City, earning the top spot on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. Just had an absolutely fantastic session, going after corporate welfare, fighting for property tax relief, voting for taxpayers on issue after issue after issue. East Texas traditionally produces a lot of very strong performers on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. That same area, just east of Dallas, also elected State Senator Bob Hall, who's our top performer there in the Texas Senate. Excellent session for Bryan Slayton, and a reminder what most folks probably think of him on is fighting on the gender modification front, right? Trying to seek to stop the chemical castration of minors. The Fiscal Responsibility Index doesn't even include issues like that.
Oh, we've talked about that,
yeah. Score might be even higher on just like a pure conservative index or something.
We talked about that. I mean, it's sort of the interesting thing you see where there's obviously various different reporting tools that groups will put out looking at lawmakers, but by and large, they tend to kind of be the same regardless of the issue. A conservative is generally a conservative on all issues, and we see a lot of that. I have to note that while Bryan Slayton was the highest performer in the House, the lowest scoring Republican was Kyle Cassell. That's right,
scoring 70 points lower than State Representative Bryan Slayton, just 1 point higher than the best performing Democrat. Kyle Cassell, a lawmaker who represents the area around College Station up to Waco, probably not the area you would consider to maybe have the most liberal Republicans in the state of Texas.
No, I got to join the Bryan College Station Tea Party last night, and a lot of them were unfortunately not surprised to see that Kyle Cassell was the most liberal Republican, but certainly a disconnect there between some of the conservative folks who are active in the party, active in the movement down there, and their representation up in Austin. Were there any general kind of surprises this year from what you saw as far as the scores laid out?
Yeah, there were a couple lawmakers who performed better this session than they did previously. That's something that's pretty rare on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. A lot of people who support term limits recognize that politicians get worse the longer they spend in office. There's the often saying that they're like diapers; they need to be changed regularly,
right,
or they start to stink. We actually saw a number of lawmakers do a little bit better. I'll give a shout out to State Representative Terry Wilson from just north of here in Georgetown and Marble Falls, who did a little bit better on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. But by and large, kind of the biggest surprise, I guess, is that the proof is in the pudding, right? and that lawmakers were trying to say this is the most conservative session we've ever had after they didn't pass property tax relief. The budget still funds in-state tuition for illegal aliens. They did nothing all the legislation on election integrity failed. The free speech protections on social media failed. The Republican Party of Texas priorities were left undone, let alone, conservative priorities of grassroots Texans that were additional things, right? I mean, most people think the priorities are like the minimum that you get done, right?
Sure.
To just meet standard. Lawmakers failed across the board, and their scores reflect that. You can't have the most conservative session in history and not deliver conservative victories to grassroots Texans.
We've heard from the governor that there's going to be at least 2 special sessions here. Is there going to be an index for the special sessions?
So
I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah. So if the special session contains measures that benefit taxpayers or harm taxpayers transversely, right? If they want to do a tax increase or something like that, we would crack back open the index and go in there and adjust it. But really, we give lawmakers a grade based off their performance in the Texas legislature during their term. And so it'll adjust their index score. There won't be a new index score.
Got it. So if folks want to see how their lawmakers performed on the index, where can they go to do that?
Well, you can check out our website, texastaxpayers.com, for all the latest from Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. Specifically, the index can be found at index.texastaxpayers.com. I encourage you to go there and find out how your lawmaker performed on the index. Did they do well? Did they do okay? Did they get a score that you're not particularly happy to put on your refrigerator?
Awesome. Thank you so much for explaining and walking us through that, Cary.
Thanks, Brandon.
And speaking of lawmakers feeling pressure, Governor Greg Abbott might be feeling a little bit of it from his current Republican primary opponents. Earlier this week, Governor Abbott announced all of a sudden, after the legislature had left, his plan for Texas to build a border wall. Check this out.
The administration has abandoned its responsibility to apply federal law to secure the border and to enforce the immigration laws. And Texans are suffering as a consequence of that neglect by the Biden administration. In the federal government's absence, Texas is stepping up to get the job done. We will build the wall, we will secure the border, but most importantly, we will restore safety to the citizens who live in the Lone Star State.
Well, as I mentioned, this big announcement from Governor Abbott, and you see that he's flanked by lawmakers. He's got Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick there. He's got Speaker of the House Dade Phelan as he's making this big announcement that Texas is going to build a border wall. Well, this is all coming after the legislature has already left, right? He's doing this through executive orders. Here to talk a little bit about what Abbott announced, as well as some other issues going on this week, is Jeramy Kitchen, our Capitol correspondent. First of all, Jeremy, I know that you got the chance to, you've been to 2 events, I think, this week, right?
That's right, yeah. A lot of excitement out there.
Yeah.
That's great.
And so, looking at this border wall issue, first of all, what is it exactly that Governor Abbott announced?
Sure. So he announced $250 million, I believe, as kind of this down payment, if you will. He directed, the way they go about doing this is he directed the Texas Facilities Commission to essentially kind of hire a contractor, a program manager for a would-be wall. Didn't necessarily get into specifics. In fact, when he was pressed on it, talked about, that's for the program manager to kind of decide. But to get the ball rolling, if you will, on both continuing and or creating new, where it doesn't exist, a wall, and kind of working with landowners and stuff to make that happen. Had a website, which I assume we'll talk about, where he kind of directed anyone for private donations to go in, you can help fund the wall, that sort of thing.
Yes, and this is all coming in the context of the fact that, there was actually legislation during the session where they could have taken the opportunity to build a border wall. There was other legislation where they could have entered some of created these interstate border compacts for other states to pool resources on this. And yet, both of those bills, and I'll specifically focus on the border wall bill filed by Brian Slayton in the House, was not even given a committee hearing in the House. And so I think a lot of people watching it, right, thought maybe this is a good move, right? We'll see exactly how it plays out. But if this is a priority now, why was it not a priority then?
Sure. Abbott was actually asked this question in the press conference, and it's somewhat irritating. His answer to it was something to the effect of like, well, this is, for those saying this is politics, this isn't politics, this is just happening. It is, to your point, notable that, look, the Biden administration has been there since January 20th. In fact, they signaled well before then, right, what their policy was going to be. There were bills, to your point, to include Brian Slayton's bill that does effectively what he's trying to do, at least with respect to the border wall. Brian Slayton's bill talked about private donations or soliciting private donations. It named the overall wall the Donald Trump wall, for instance, right? Talked about continuing it and soliciting both private and public help for it, and would have demanded that the governor seek reimbursement from the federal government. Not even given a hearing in the House at all.
Interesting. You actually had Brian Slayton, like I mentioned, the author of that bill. We talked to him, and he said he was actually at the signing. He was behind Abbott there, but afterwards he told me, he said, quote, "I'm happy the governor is acting, but I have questions. If he could have done this unilaterally, why didn't he do it years ago? I think the legislature should be the ones making these decisions." That's certainly something that maybe, Brian's out there actually saying it, but I think it's probably something that a lot of lawmakers are thinking privately, as they have been thinking, not only when it comes to this particular issue, but towards a lot of issues that they've seen the governor issue executive orders on.
Sure. I mean, last week the governor talked about how he at least initially approved of the over $1 billion that was allocated to just border security collectively in the budget, right? But that is not for the wall. So this $250 million that is kind of this down payment, as he called it, did come from, right, something else. But all that to say is that, they talked about it generally. He had, I think, 2 press conferences where he talked about the kind of this new drug that's coming over the border in larger sums. But it obviously wasn't a priority of leadership at that time. So what gives as to
why his point, and his response would be, well, we're seeing greater immigration now. His opponents say that this has been a problem for, well over 6 years here.
Sure.
In fact, Debbie, watching right now, seems to have that opinion exactly. She says Abbott seems more interested in what helps his reelection campaign, not Texas citizens. That's interesting. We reached out to some of these candidates that are opposing Governor Abbott in the primary. Number one, you had Don Huffines, who entered the race and really made this kind of border security a real cornerstone of his campaign. And what you actually see, he says, is that, he's kind of out there taking credit. He had a bit of a tongue-in-cheek statement where he said he was glad to see the governor joining his campaign. Also you've got Chad Prather, who's also in the race, saying, quote, "Finally, after more than 6 months of federal incompetence, Governor Abbott is finally taking action to protect our border and stop illegal immigration into our great state." But he also added, and we've heard this from some other folks as well, that we must also push federal government to allow our fine Border Patrol and ICE agents to do their jobs. The issue is seeping into America, and every citizen needs to be aware of what's going on. This is a national crisis. As Texans, we are on the front lines, and we must put a stop to it. And this border wall, as you mentioned, that $250 million, I mean, that's supposed to be the down payment to start this thing. But additionally, the governor announced a website, right, where people can essentially crowdfund and donate to this effort. And I think on the one hand, right, I think people who have been wanting to see this wall happen think that that could be a good thing, right? Be able to, more money, the better. On the other hand, the legislature just passed a $250 billion budget.
Right.
Why was this not prioritized then?
Correct. I mean, and who knows? It's an unknown as to what is the final cost of this going to be, too. And, this goes back under the Trump administration, how Mexico is going to pay for it, and then it turned into something else. And now under the Biden administration, having states kind of do their own sort of thing here, it is unknown as to what the price tag for this is going to be.
Yeah, it wasn't just, I want to mention this, it wasn't just he signed an order with this $250 million for the Texas border wall. He signed a letter or an order starting the job search for a project manager for this. But the third thing he did was he signed a letter asking President Joe Biden to please return the federal land along the border so that they could take it over and build the wall themselves. I don't think we've gotten a response yet from the
Sure.
Biden administration to his request, but we'll.
I mean, I think it's also worth mentioning too, right? Last week when he had his original border summit, and he kind of previewed this wall announcement this week. Another thing that he talked about is his new task force was going to work with landowners to solicit reimbursement for damages on their property from trespassing, things like that, from illegal immigrants from the federal government. But he stopped short of being like, how much teeth do you actually have there? Like, you can ask, but are you actually going to get the reimbursements?
Right. And so that's one of the big issues. We're going to see how this plays out, but certainly is very interesting, especially in the context of this election that he finds himself in. I should also note that we talked about special sessions. This is something that could come up in a special session, perhaps, and even you've seen Brian Slayton request that as well.
That's right. I would be surprised if it comes up at all.
Right.
Sure.
So looking at the calendar, today's the 18th. June 20th, which is Sunday, that is the deadline for the governor to sign bills, or not, or to veto them, right?
Correct.
First of all, how does a bill, kind of, 101 here, bill reaches a governor's desk, what are his options?
Sure. So he can choose to sign it, which is kind of this public statement of, I support this, right? He can choose to veto it, which is this very public statement of like, I don't support this. Or he can choose to not do anything at all, which will effectively make it go into law itself, right?
So not signing it is kind of the same as signing it.
Correct. Yeah. Normally, like, signing is more, it's not fair to say it's ceremonial. It's not. It kind of adds weight when the governor signs it, right? Saying like he approves of this sort of thing. But there's effectively two ways the bill can become law. One, by him signing it, or ignoring it.
Well, as of 10:59 a.m. before we went live today, one of those bills, the big bills that have not been signed yet, but of course we're expecting will be signed shortly if it hasn't already while I've been talking, is the budget, right? Is that big $250 billion budget, as well as the supplemental budget. And, there's some questions there right now. Specifically, you go back and you look at just a couple weeks ago, when the governor was threatening, he said he was going to defund the legislature. He was going to veto Article 10 of the budget, which is the article that funds the legislature. He's doubled down on this at least once or twice since then, said he's going to do it, and yet right now there's still some questions as to whether or not he's ultimately going to take that step.
Right. It certainly would be a big step. It would send kind of some waves, if you will, throughout the kind of Capitol insider world if that happened. I tend to think that if he does anything, it might be maybe more specific. He has the power of line item veto, right? So we talk about the legislature as an overall article of one of many, Article 10, right? But if something is going to happen, I wouldn't be surprised if he maybe kind of did the line item portion, something within Article 10, one of the strategies, if you will. I think that might be the approach, or maybe he does nothing at all. Maybe he backs away from it, altogether. You did see a few Democrats indicate this week, in fact, that, any would-be special session, they're still contemplating not being there, right? Which, of course, is what caused him to do this to begin with. So.
Different subject altogether, but something else, speaking of a special session that Abbott has said that we are going to see in there as of this week, is strengthening a critical race theory ban. There was, of course, legislation that moved through the legislature and made it to the governor's desk. The author and a number of lawmakers say it's actually the strongest ban in the country. Meanwhile, you have others who are saying that it's actually been pretty weakened by the legislature. And it seems that Governor Abbott is saying now that the legislature needs to come back and actually fix it.
Sure. It was definitely interesting because at least initially he's talked about the obvious things being on a would-be special session would be election integrity and bail reform, two of his emergency items that failed at the last minute there in the Texas House. But sure, we've been hearing, it's kind of this mixed messages, right? We've been hearing about how strong this is the strongest ban in the nation on using critical race theory, and then you have the governor say, oh, well, we need to come back and do something. It's definitely sending mixed signals to especially activists that care about this issue. It's like, wait, is this the strongest ban, or do we still need to do something on it?
Right. As of now, we've not heard the specifics from the governor yet on what he believes needs to be fixed in it. We expect that will come ahead of an expected special session. Probably also expect that announcement to come next week, I would imagine, now that the veto, that kind of signing deadline rather, is in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, I think a lot of, if I'm Governor Abbott, I assume I'd probably want to use most of my media attention on both bills I'm signing or vetoing or kind of initiatives I'm working on. I assume he'll pivot here shortly after Sunday's deadline.
Well, you even have a lot of citizens fired up over this issue. I mean, especially in recent months over critical race theory. In fact, we've got an article up by Tara Collin about a rally that's actually taking place in Fort Worth during the Fort Worth ISD school board meeting, where they're going to be rallying against the district's use of this controversial curriculum. Sharon asks, has anyone heard anything about China buying up a lot of land in South Texas to build energy plants? And in fact, I had to look this up to see where the status of it was. There was actually legislation filed that has made it to Governor Abbott's desk. That's actually one of the bills that he's not yet signed. So it'd be interesting to see. It would actually prohibit foreign-owned companies from operating these critical infrastructure plants. And so we'll see if he signs that. I would have to imagine he will, but could be a surprise. On Monday we're going to have kind of the list of what are the bills that he vetoed and take a look at some of those. And I think it'll be interesting to see where exactly he decides to come down on some of these bills.
Sure. Historically, I don't think there's a requirement to, but historically they release like this list, right, and kind of the explanation as to why. And so I think, we'll see that Monday.
Interesting. Well, throughout this last week, the week before, and kind of probably going into next week, right, we're still taking a look at some of these autopsy reports you can find at TexasScorecard.com. I know Jeremy has worked on several. A number of our staff, our writers here, have worked on them. Taking a look at some of those big issues during the legislative session and what exactly happened to them, right? Sometimes they're successes, constitutional carry, right? Sure. That was signed yesterday. Other times, things like banning taxpayer-funded lobbying, the story is a little more sad. And so we've got those up at TexasScorecard.com, as well as our Texas directory, which is always there. You can find your lawmakers, figure out how to contact them, look at how they're scoring as these different indexes come out, rating the legislators. We're going to have a number of those scores up at the Texas directory. And Jeremy, last but certainly not least, this week in Texas, we've got a new episode to expect Monday.
That's right, on Monday, and I assume we'll be talking about right the what he did and did not, what he signed, vetoed, and then likely an impending announcement about special sessions.
Okay, great. So if you haven't already subscribed to that on your favorite podcasting platform, do that right now. You're not going to want to miss next week's episode. I want to thank everybody watching this week. I want to thank Paul, watching from the Woodlands, Virginia, tuning in from Granbury, Paula, watching from Conroe, Debbie, tuning in from Central Texas, Keisha from Fort Bend, and Carol, watching from Navarro County. I want to say hello to all of those folks and let y'all know that if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them down in the comments or reach out to us. We try to get to them as soon as possible. But for right now, thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great weekend. Thank you for tuning in to The Headline. If you want to stay up to date with the news you need to be an informed citizen, be sure to check out TexasScorecard.com and subscribe to our email list. You can also listen to this show and other shows on whatever podcast platform you use. Subscribe and review our show now to ensure other Texans can be informed.